Hi there, I'm Claire McDonnell Liu and this is the Family Health Lab. In today's conversation, I'm talking with Dr. Peter Ballerstedt about how we've been misled on the climate debate, how cattle benefit the soil, planet and human health, why meds, that's meat, eggs, dairy and seafood, are essential for children's growth and for their amazing brains to thrive.
You're listening to the Family Health Lab. Healthy parents, healthy kids.
Hi there, Peter. Thank you so much for jumping on with me and sharing your time. I know it's in the afternoon there, late in the afternoon. I've been looking forward to this chat because I feel that this is a subject I've got loads to learn. You're an expert in agriculture, soils, meat, cattle, protein you talk about as well, and managing grasslands. These are kind of topics that kind of get you going and that you work in and talk on?
A little loath to take on the title of expert, but because I find myself in this strange sort of bridge tween where I know people that know a lot more about ruminant nutrition than I do. I know a lot of people that know a great deal more about grasslands, et cetera, et cetera. And then I know a lot of people that know a great deal more about metabolic health than I do. I just happen to be somebody that's found this role where I kind of know about all of those and I kind of connect the dots.
And I like that term that you use, building bridges. You refer to that. I've heard you in talks, and you refer to it on your social media. That seems really important to you to build the herd, as a pun that you use, but also to learn about these different areas, and connect different tribes. So, do you want to talk about why that's important?
Our number one health crisis, and this is globally, is malnutrition. And it manifests itself a little differently depending on where you are in the world. I'm convinced that what we're seeing in the sense of diabetes and obesity and related disorders, that's malnutrition. Um, and so it's really important that people hear that there is this information that they could use to adopt a lifestyle that has been effective at addressing that for many, many people. At the same time, I'm convinced that animal source food is essential for human development and health, and that ruminant animals in particular are essential for sustainable food systems. And so I want people to know those things as well. One, because I think it's exciting and hopefully I can make it interesting to other people, but also because I think that there are debates and conversations and policies that are being entertained and they're really not well founded. And I think it's important for people to have this information as well as to understand just the crying need for some work in other parts of the world. In other words, we're doing things voluntarily in the high income countries that people in the low and middle income countries deserve to have the option of even experiencing, right? So I see this as many layered, but at the end of the day, we're all just trying to do the best we can. And I want to make sure that I can do what's possible for me to convey information so that people can really make informed decisions and maybe find some answers to some problems that they're facing or concerns that they have. Part of this is I want my agricultural tribes to hear the metabolic health message. So I want to bring practitioners and researchers into my American Forage and Grassland Council annual meeting or the local cattlemen or what have you, the range science meetings. And at the same time, I want people within the metabolic health space to hear what's happening in the agricultural space as well. So that's the bridge building. I want us to learn from each other.
I love that you call it multi-layered, because it certainly is, and you've hit on a lot of the layers that kind of build this complex web of puzzles. You're calling it a crisis, a malnutrition crisis. I've heard you refer to it as, and you're across two existential crises: the malnutrition crisis and the climate change crisis, both facing humanity, both really huge, complex problems facing us. So on the malnutrition, I'm not sure if people really understand where we are with that, what the picture looks like. I was reading that a quarter of the global population would be considered under the World Health Organization definition as malnourished, which may surprise a lot of people, and that's not just the low income, middle income countries. That's in the wealthy countries. That's in the countries we live in. You're in the US. I'm in Australia at the moment, from the UK. But all of us are affected. A quarter of the population, 2 billion. And you referred in your low carb Sydney talk, which I met you there, which was lovely to meet you, and I heard your talk. You referred to stunting and children being brought up stunted, and I really think that's something that's escaping us, that we're not really addressing. What are your thoughts on our awareness of how important that problem is?
Well, I don't think there's sufficient awareness, and the statistics are something like between a fifth and a quarter of children under 5 years old globally are stunted, which is not only stature, it's brain development. And so these are human beings that won't be able to achieve their potential because they're not getting the essential nutrients that they need to develop properly. There's lots of reasons for that, but a primary one is they're not getting the animal source foods, the meat, eggs, dairy, seafood, which, again, WHO says it are the best sources for those nutrients. UNICEF says something like 60% of children from 6 to 24 months of age are not getting, 60% are not getting meat, eggs, dairy, seafood. And that's another critical development stage. So this is something that starts prior to pregnancy with the woman's nutrition prior to conceiving. This is what applies during pregnancy. This is what happens during the mother's lactation, as well as the infant and young child development. We also understand that this is also important for old people. Seniors need a higher quality diet in order to maintain a health span. And that, so we know those pieces. We know that something like 800 and some odd million people in the world are calorically undernourished. This is what we typically think of when we think of malnourishment, but that's merely caloric, right? They're not getting enough energy. Okay, we've got 2.2 billion people in the world that are overweight or obese. So you add those together, that's 3 billion human beings today that are malnourished. Now, people don't always understand that you'll still read people referring to obesity as overnutrition. In other words, obesity is the result of overeating or not exercising enough. Yet there's some good information to suggest that it's from perhaps people eating a lot of highly processed carbohydrates and not sufficient, whole foods, not sufficient protein of high enough quality. They're not getting the vitamins and minerals that they need. In the US and in the UK, something like a fifth of women of childbearing age are anemic. That's like you say here. And this is, I understand that there are economically challenged communities in high-income countries, not denying that. However, when I go and look at other parts of the world and I see what the economics are like there, again, a lot of times people are making choices, and those choices aren't well informed. And so we're finding women not receiving the nutrition that they need because they've made some decision that they thought was in the best interest of their health, the best interest of the planet, other reasons. And if we can have a respectful dialogue, we might discover that there's some other information that might lead them to make a different decision, especially when we realize you're harming yourself, and even more, you're harming your children.
I think these are massively fundamental points. We're talking about people being given information, then making a decision. And we're talking about animal-based foods. We're talking about, you call it eat your daily meds, meat, eggs, dairy, and seafood. And as you've said, very, very well-trusted organisations are saying that they are optimal for children's development, but for during pregnancy, so neuronal development can take place properly. The child's brain can form and function, and that brain development can happen in those important 0 to 3 years. With children, we're seeing an absolute crisis of autoimmune conditions, anxiety, all the A's, the autism, ADHD, adiposity, with the overweight of the children, all of those things being linked to not having proper nutrition. And you're coming back to that point, saying 60% of children are not receiving. Are you saying they're not receiving enough meat, eggs, dairy, seafood, or they're not receiving none? That's crazy statistic, 60%. And we're bringing this back to a more, as you say, a more sensible debate, conversation about this, so that people can make the best choice for themselves, for their children, before they're born and then afterwards, but also developing in childhood, and then yourself through your own adult life to be in optimal health. So it's, and you refer to the term stunted, and that's, we're seeing that in the statistics. The children in the UK and the US, they've been shrinking since 1985. They're not keeping up with the height rates of other countries. Children in the UK are 7 centimeters shorter than children, or Dutch children of the age of 5 years. I mean, that's incredible, 7 centimeters. So stunted in that way, and then we're potentially not developing the brain. We're not giving them the ability to meet their full potential, possibly because of a misinformed debate. So the climate change debate really touches into the global malnutrition pandemic. They really overlap, as you said. This is multi-layered. So that term, malnourished, we're talking about hidden hunger. It's not just those people who are overweight, it's underweight, but it's people who are across the weight spectrum, but they're not receiving optimal vitamins and minerals to thrive. So yeah, it's called hidden hunger, overfed, and malnourished, and that's what we're seeing in Western countries.
There's a thought that humans, other animals, that they're into, what if what we eat is influenced by what we eat? So if we're eating a diet that's heavily based on processed cereals, so wheat, oats, maize, we call it corn, rye, barley, rice, those are deficient, those are low in lysine, which is an essential amino acid. Okay, so that's why we in the US, and I assume in other places, would feed soybeans with corn in the ration for pigs, so that we would supply enough lysine. Okay, now when we process cereals, which are already low in lysine, we make what little lysine is there even less available. And anytime you make something brown or crispy, you're essentially binding lysine to carbohydrate. And you're doing that in such a way that you can't then access it. Okay, so now you're making a situation worse. So what if there's some way for the organism to say, oh, I'm not getting enough protein. I need to meet my protein requirement. And I'm trying to do that on this cereal-based diet. Got to keep it straight. Ration animals, diet people. And so I keep eating to try to get it. Okay. Well, we're also getting a lot of carbohydrate. We're also getting a lot of other whatever else is in that. And we still may not be getting enough. And this is a really critical issue. It impacts conversations about environmental issues because we were not talking about protein properly. So this is a problem more and more people are becoming aware of. There's a condition called kwashiorkor, which is the sort of the bloated belly but wasted legs and arms of children that you see under famine conditions, that those heartbreaking pictures. And I've been told that the word comes from West Africa, and it basically means the sickness that arrives when the next baby comes. So the image is you have one child that's been weaned and now is on whatever the cereal diet is when the next baby comes. And so now that cereal diet is not providing the nutrients, the nutrition that's necessary. Well, there are now people talking about subclinical kwashiorkor. And what are all these? And again, I'm not that kind of a doctor. I'm just a forage ruminant guy. But one of the key things about ruminants is that ruminants do this really, I would say, essential role of upcycling. They take resources we human beings cannot utilize directly or are of low value to humans, and they from them create highest value foods. So meat and milk is of highest nutritional quality. And you could make cheese or butter or whatever out of the milk, right? So, and most of the feed that the ruminants consume is not human edible. Like 96%, 96 on a global scale.
For those of us who don't know what a ruminant is,
What? You don't know what a ruminant is? Yes, good point.
Hooves. Am I on the right track? So the cows, the goats,
Cow,
the sheep,
goats, deer, moose, bison, buffalo, antelope, giraffe. So these are animals. Yes, they have a cloven hoof. Some have horns, some have antlers. They also have, most importantly, a multi-compartmented stomach. So we talk about 4 chambers. Really, there's 3, but there's a portion of the first one that we say, the reticulum is one, the rumen, omasum, abomasum. So the point of all that is these are the best utilizers of plant fiber. And ruminants existed long before Homo sapien or genus Homo showed up. So these are the organisms in ecological systems that can take cellulose, that's plant fiber, and because of the microorganisms that live within their rumen, the energy that was stored in that cellulose in photosynthesis can be accessed. So the difference between cellulose, which we can't utilize, and and starch, which we can, is that the glucose units are hooked together differently. And so we obviously make amylase so we can digest starch, but no vertebrate animal makes the cellulase enzyme that would be necessary to get the glucose units that are in cellulose, only the microorganisms. So those are free living, but they're also in ruminants. Okay, so the vast majority of the carbohydrate that's formed in global photosynthesis is cellulose. So the vast majority of biomass that agriculture produces is not human edible.
Mm-hmm.
Even if we produce a wheat crop or a maize crop, over half of that biomass is not human edible. One study out of Europe said that for every kilo of vegan food, that was their term, something like 4 kilos of inedible biomass are produced. And so, one of my lines is you can't get milk from almonds, but you can get milk from almond hulls, because the hull around the almond, we feed those to dairy cattle in California.
I didn't
It's a
know that.
major
Oh,
feed resource in California.
mm,
Okay, so
mm,
a lot of people have this idea somehow that there's a separation, like you could have plant agriculture without animal agriculture, or vice versa, and it's just not true. So that's why I say that animal agriculture in general, ruminants in particular, are essential for sustainable food systems. And then you could drill down and look at some other things. So these ruminant animals, um, some of the earliest domestication of animals were the sheep and the goats and the cattle, yeah, horses and dogs as well. Um, and the herding sort of nomadic lifestyle predates the agricultural, sedentary lifestyle. But even once people settled down in growing crops, they needed draft animals. They needed the manure that the animals produced as fertilizer. And they continued to produce livestock for production of human food. So there are people who want to say that if we eliminated livestock, we would be able to feed more people. That's false. There are people who say that if we stopped using this land for livestock, we could grow more food. That's false. There are people who say that if we stopped eating livestock, that would make a significant contribution to lowering carbon emissions. That's false. So where do we, other than that?
They're huge points, though, because that kind of goes all the way into what's happening with the climate change and the diet argument. But I just wanted to home in on that point that you said earlier, which is part of those false statements. That you're saying that 96% of the grassland used for grazing would only be able to be grazed. It wouldn't be able to be utilised for crops. Is that the statistic?
The 96% is the percent of the feed that goes into the ruminant animals, domestic ruminant animals. 96% of that on a global scale is not human edible.
I see. Okay.
And
Yeah.
and the 4% that is cereals, and that represents 10% of the global cereal production.
Okay.
So that's where we
Wow.
are, sort of, as opposed to what many people say. In terms of land use, the best example I have is to imagine a soccer field. Sorry, football field. No, you've got a different football. Sorry, it's a soccer field. It's a soccer field. Okay. English football, not Australian. Okay. So if you imagine, so there's a difference between agricultural land and arable land. So arable land is a type of agricultural land. It's the land that we can till that's suitable for crop production. Okay, so all arable land is agricultural, but not all agricultural land is arable. Okay, so it's important to, and people either unintentionally or intentionally get those confused. So let's imagine this soccer field. If I looked at the entire, within the boundaries of the field, that would be the land area of the world. Okay. The agricultural land would go from one goal line, but it would be a couple meters short of the center circle edge. Okay, so not even half the field is agricultural land. The arable land would only go from the goal line to the penalty spot within that 18-meter space, right? The penalty area. And as one friend of mine said, yeah, the spot's getting closer and the goalie's getting nervous because we're losing agricultural land due to urban development, due to soil degradation, due to shifts in climatic patterns around the world. So arable land is a precious resource. There's lots of work being done on what to do and how to do things better. But that's just sort of the nature. And then on top of that, we need to remember, so first of all the rest of that agricultural land, the best agricultural use of that land is with grazing animals. Because if you till it, it's subject to higher rates of erosion than the better quality arable land, or it's not even deep enough to till, or the slope or rainfall patterns or what have you. There's lots of reasons for that land not being arable.
And isn't so it's not arable. We cannot put crops on it. But so isn't having ruminant animals, having livestock that's well managed, isn't there a number of benefits for the land, for the soil, which you've touched on, but we're having, we're in a crisis really with our soil, the topsoil health being depleted. So what does well-managed livestock look like?
So grassland, in order to remain healthy, must be grazed or burnt. It can't be allowed to accumulate large amounts of biomass that just sits there. And then in areas where there's sufficient rainfall that would allow woody species to come in, that would normally be kept out by grazing or periodic burning, then that brush encroachment can cause problems, not the least of which is, fire fuel burden. So all of these, we want the grassland to remain healthy for the biological diversity. Plants as well as animals. We want the grassland to be healthy for greater infiltration, so rainfall or precipitation would go into the soil rather than running off, and maybe there's a reduction in flood potential. And so now we're dealing with fire and flood mitigation as a result of proper management. What it's going to mean is whatever the species involved, not overgrazing, and that's going to look different depending on where you are and the species involved. It's going to mean not having animals on land when it's subject to, severe treading damage, etc. Those are sort of basic things. We want to have the grass given sufficient rest after defoliation. All the plants, not just grass. Grass can sometimes be used sort of generically as anything that would be growing, and technically it's not true, but allow those plants to recover from the defoliation that took place. So think of it this way: you've got the solar, energy collectors out there, and you've just ripped off all their solar panels, and now they have to call down to the battery to liberate some stored energy. to regrow. If they have that, maybe they're annual plants, and maybe they just kind of have to recover with whatever, above ground structures they have. So this is part of the challenge. Are we dealing with perennials? Are we dealing with annuals? Are we dealing with grasses? Are we dealing with broadleaves? Do we have sufficient legumes in there to contribute nitrogen to then be cycled? And there's lots and lots of ecosystem services that come from well-managed grasslands. And it turns out that grasslands are our most endangered biome globally. In Brazil, the most endangered biomes are their grasslands, not what everybody thinks about. So again, we have this difference between, reality versus perception. And I understand that at a certain level, your perception is your reality, but we need to get the better story out there.
Do you have an example of somebody who's turned their land around with this, changed the way that they look after their livestock and seen the difference in the land?
The awareness of the importance of soils goes back to almost a century now. And grass farming was something that people were aware of and talking about, like I say, going back into the early post-World War II period. But of course, a lot of things changed coming out of that period. And so for any number of reasons, we're where we are today. But the reality is there's a number of people who've been doing this. One of the things I want people to understand is that there are these things like the New Zealand Grassland Association, there's the American Forage and Grassland Council, there's the British Grassland Society. There are all these groups that are interested in these topics, and there are researchers that have been supporting them. So, I was trained by people who were trained by people who were trained by people, and it goes back a long way. What we didn't do a good job of was making people aware of what was happening. And so, there is no sustainability without profit, right? If the family cannot exist from the farming enterprise, then they leave the land, and that's a problem. And most farmers that I'm aware of are concerned about, stewardship. And the ethos of leaving the land in better shape than when you got it is not a new concept. Now, we've learned more. We have different tools. We have more information than we did, back in 1900, for example. But it's a lot of these are not new things. So that's an important piece for people to know. Another is I got it from a friend of mine. He's a family medicine practitioner in Western Montana. And he had a patient. He got a call from the local emergency department and said, "Would you please come talk sense to your patient?" It turns out his patient had turned up in the emergency department with a heart attack, but he was not going to accept, he wasn't going to check himself in. And so when my friend got there, the farmer said, "Look," or the rancher, he said, "Look, I'll be here tomorrow. You'll do whatever, and I'll sign whatever release is necessary. But the cows have to be fed tonight, and I haven't made arrangements for that. I'll make arrangements for that for the rest of whatever time. But I've got, cows come first." And so people have this idea somehow that they abuse animals. And there are just stories after stories after stories that'll break your heart about people who put their own lives at risk to take care of the animals that they have charge for.
Was he okay in the end?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
He got treated?
He came back the next day. Yeah, just like he said. And he may have even gotten help from the community before. Like his neighbor may have shown up and said, "Don't be an idiot. Go back to the hospital. I got this." I don't know. But, that ethic that's there,
Mm.
And part
Yeah.
of, so we've gotten really separated from where, from the rural reality. And many people who live in rural environments today are still separated from agriculture, right? I mean, because they're living there because they have the means or the situation or whatever, but they're not dependent on, producing a saleable product from whatever piece of land that they have management of. Um, and so then I'm faced with people who are doing that, but some level they've been told that what they're producing is bad for people's health, right?
Yes,
And
it must be hard when they're
it,
trying to look after the land and they're
yeah.
working, every day of the year, Christmas Day included, birthdays, all of that. I haven't got time for a heart attack.
Mm,
So,
mm, mm,
um,
mm,
and they're being demonized. Their product is being demonized and put in the same bag as an industrialized product. I
mm.
mean, is that really one of the big problems? We're really confusing industrialized meats products with well produced, grass fed,
Yeah.
free ranging, pasture
No,
raised.
I think it's more a case of we've been told that the naturally occurring saturated fats that come with animal source foods are a health hazard. We've even been told that the protein that comes from animal source foods are a health hazard, and that it would be better if we got these from pulses or soy products or God knows where. The problem, of course, is that nobody eats those things raw, right? So they're highly processed for the most part. And then you've got to deal with the definition of processed, right? Okay, fine. But there was a narrative that we were sold going back to the 50s about what caused heart disease. And then that led to dietary guidelines, and that led to marketing of products, and that led to all manner of problems now. Um, so I think that we need to get people to, well, so, in 2007, I was a 51-year-old balding, obese, pre diabetic. Today, I'm just balding. Um, it came as the transformation for me came as a result of reading a book called Protein Power Life Plan by Michael and Mary Dan Eades.
Mhm.
And then as I read that, and then as I read Gary Taubes' Good Calories, Bad Calories, Nina Teicholz's book, The Big Fat Surprise, Why Butter, Meat, and Cheese Belong in a Healthy Diet, the books that Gary Taubes wrote after that, um, it just gets clearer and clearer that this has never been a scientific issue. Science didn't get us to where we are. And I then say science won't solve it because it wasn't a scientific problem to begin with. Right?
We have lots of different interests and special interests
Yes.
behind that, which is a huge wormhole. Some kind of careerists, some skewed research, also ideologies around plant-based foods,
Sure.
and skewed science. So it's a complex web. But back to your own health story, how did it feel to be able to turn that around then, when people were not keto, they were not low carb,
Mm.
in the masses that people are interested in the topic today?
Right.
So was that like, a release? Did you feel angry that
Well,
you've
yeah.
been offered a lifetime of medication?
So there was that one time when I was walking across a parking lot and I had 4 10-pound bags, 2 in each arm. And I was going, son of a gun, I used to carry this around all the time. Right.
Wow. Yeah.
So there was that. Um, yes, when I first read Gary Taubes' Good Calories, Bad Calories, I got mad. I got mad because the people I had been trained to serve had been falsely accused and demonized. I got mad because, in the words of one of my colleagues, he said, having read it, he said, I couldn't get a paper published in the agronomy journal based on this. Right? So there's this, so now you're not just talking about the demonization of animal agriculture, ruminant animal agriculture. You've got people that are, because of their actions, they are lowering the scientific standards. And so as people learn about that, then they began to distrust others who have been doing scientific work, right? Well, you can have a study that proves anything, they say, and things along that line. So they've really done a disservice. These experts, we've not been well served. Let's just leave it at that. So now I want people to understand that they don't need to spend extra, right? Affordability and access is a critical issue in high income countries, let alone the rest of the world. So
Absolutely.
people should go to the store, buy what's affordable, what's accessible, and what's appropriate to them for their background, right? There are lots of people in the world that will never eat beef for philosophical reasons. I'm not going to, I wish to say everything in a respectful manner. That still leaves other animal source foods that they do eat, right?
Absolutely.
And so it's important for people to get that that should be the feature on their plate.
There's two things I wanted to touch on there. The protein. You mentioned earlier that people are trying to get their protein intake from soy, beans, pulses, chemically produced in a lab. Patties.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
is that going to help the planet? But is it going to give them the protein they need? Can I have this much beans, legumes, and will it equate to and take away from the steak or the
No
chops or
and
whatever?
no. It isn't better for the planet, and it isn't going to be what they need. Now, the best example I can give is, and I don't want to get too in the weeds, I've given presentations on it, but when we look with the available sophistication at the protein quality in what I call plant pucks, like hockey pucks,
Mm-hmm.
the Impossible and the Beyond burgers, right? So those are two different brands. Impossible has S's in it. That's soy. That's how I remember. The Beyond has pea protein extract as
Good
its,
way to. Mm.
that's the primary protein sources in these. Okay. Um, the pea protein extract does not qualify for a protein quality claim. Okay, so the Beyond Burger is by itself is not considered a good source of protein. Now the Impossible Burger does because of the soy. Okay, but nobody's eating those things by themselves, right? They put them between two pieces of wheat bread, right? Okay, the Impossible Burger does not supply sufficient lysine to make up for the deficiency in the wheat. So as a meal, it doesn't qualify as a good source of protein. And that's before we look at any of the other nutrients. So um, these have been rattling around in my head because of some other um, projects I've been involved in. But Cordain and colleagues in like 2000 looked at hunter-gatherer diets. They found some populations and they tried to estimate what percentage of the calories in their diets come from plant source foods versus animal source foods. And they found a range from about 30% of calories to 100% of calories coming from animal source food, but the mean was at 70, somewhere very close to 70. So 30 was really a low tail. Okay. Nordhagen and colleagues in 2000 said that when you have a population where their percentage of calories from animal source foods gets below 30%, you start to see multiple deficiencies showing up in micronutrients. That's an interesting sort of matching. And then Viu and colleagues in 22 released a paper that said, if you're not getting half of your protein from animal source foods, you're not going to be meeting your non-protein nutrient requirements. So all of these speak to, and in the US right now, we're at about 30% of our calories coming from animal source foods in our diets. You know, we're getting a vast amount from processed foods, processed cereals, added sugars, and industrial oils. So again, the dietary problems, that the malnutrition we're facing in the US, I won't speak for your country, is different in detail from what we face in low and middle income countries. But in fundamental, it's the same thing. It's a lack of those essential nutrients, and those essential nutrients are best provided by animal source foods. And so the key thing then is to help people feel comfortable, right? Finding what's affordable and avoiding these other foods that in our country are subsidized. Right. I mean, if you're at a low socioeconomic level, then you get, various subsidies to help you buy the breakfast cereal or the low fat milk or the orange juice or and so already, these foods that I'm recommending, they're perishable, so that has impacts. They tend to be a little bit, more expensive than the cheap ultra processed stuff. And then we're faced with, well, how do I prepare this? Have we forgotten how to cook some of these things? So encouraging people to spend time, and I understand that's a precious resource for many people, working 2 jobs, doing whatever, but this has to become a priority, and we have to find ways to help them. But learn how to cook, and learn the importance of spending time together at meals, and learning, how to buy. You don't need to spend extra. I mean, that's one of the things when I hear physicians who have been for 3 decades helping free living human beings restore their metabolic health, and they're
Yeah.
telling me stories about, one of my patients went to the all you can eat pizza buffet and scraped the toppings off and didn't eat the crust but ate the top, and he got well. Right.
Isn't that fantastic? Yeah.
When another doctor talks about the guy going to the local supermarket and buying the cheapest ground beef, 80-20, 80% lean, 20% fat, and the eggs that frequently stores sell eggs at a loss to get people to come in and buy other things, right? The orange juice and whatever else. So we call them loss leaders. So that's what he ate. And in a year's time, he got well. So we need to rethink what health food, quote unquote, is. And then we learned that health food was a concept out of marketing. Health food was a concept out of an ideology that you mentioned earlier. So all of these points, but just giving people the encouragement to say, if weight is an issue, if you're concerned about diabetes in your family, if you're concerned about your children's health and development, these are the foods that they need to be, that can be part of, a healthy lifestyle. And these stories about environmental are not, you don't need to listen to them.
So we need to switch it on its head, turn it upside down, and go back to traditional foods, which we've forgotten now. If you generations away from what generations before us would have eaten, and now have been so demonized. But you're right. People taking the insides out of sandwiches when they're stuck at work. And I've done that myself. I've had a lovely lady that I worked with who was a nurse, and she was doing 12-hour shifts, and all that was available is in a vending machine. So over years, she developed a number of health problems, including obesity. And within a few weeks of working with her, she brought a packed lunch in Tupperware to a funeral of a family member, because knowing that there wouldn't be anything there. I thought that was such a special effort to bring your own Tupperware container to a funeral. But yes, we need to flip it on its head. You mentioned the environmental messages are wrong. We don't need to listen to them. But what has gone on there? Is it a case of blaming? So we do have cattle do contribute to the climate crisis. There are emissions. Your methane has been, particularly cow burps. Is it 25 times the amount of damage that methane might do than CO2? So we've got those kind of warning bells going off frequently in the newspapers and frequently coming out in reports. But how does that stand against the car industry, or industry, cars, flights, and war? These and energy.
What about the healthcare industry?
And the healthcare industry, it's a big industry. So I don't know about the healthcare industry. It's actually one that I've not considered.
Well, I'll run through a few things real quick. In the US, all of agriculture is somewhere around 9, call it 10% of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. In the US is all of agriculture. All of animal agriculture is 4%, so less than half, and beef is 2%. So those are those figures. Transportation is like 25%, power is 25%, and so that's from EPA, our government environmental protection agency. At the same time, another estimate about the U.S. healthcare industry said that the U.S. healthcare industry is a significant source of pollution, including 10% of all anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. Now, it's not an apples to apples comparison. They do things differently. So for the healthcare, they said, well, how much electricity are we using? How much fuel to heat the hospitals are we using? How much food do we serve? Whereas the EPA buckets them differently. Okay, but the point is it's significant. and it's not well appreciated. There was a survey or an estimation looking at the global pharmaceutical industry, and they said that the pharmaceutical industry was a higher intensity emitter than the automotive industry. And there was greater variability across the industry than there was in automotive. So somebody else took the value that they generated from that, and they applied it to US, and they said if the average adult American with type 2 diabetes could eliminate their medication use, just imagine that such a thing is even possible. I'm being sarcastic, right? Drug-free remission is a real thing. If you have type 2 diabetes, please find a doctor that can help you explore that. But if they could do that, they would lower their carbon footprint 29% more than if they shifted from a high meat to a vegan diet. And anytime they talk to you about dietary changes, it is for the rest of your life. Nobody stays on a vegan diet for the rest of their life. The recidivism rate is huge, right? Whatever you want to call it. Okay, so there's that. It's important for people to understand that the methane that gets burped out of a cow came from, remember we talked about the fiber? Remember, we talked about the carbohydrate that's fixed in photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is the process of taking CO2 from the atmosphere and water and reducing that CO2 carbon into carbohydrate of various kinds. And it produces oxygen as a byproduct. Thank you very much. And then the animal eats that dry matter, that feed, and a small percentage of that then gets reduced or emitted as methane into the atmosphere. They burp it out. That methane is then oxidized to CO2 in about 10 years. So it's a cycling of CO2 within 10 years. There's no new CO2 being introduced in that process. Compare that to the burning of fossil fuels, in which case you've got new, in quotes, the CO2 that gets emitted from burning fossil fuels didn't start that process in the atmosphere within recent time, right? Also, if you were to take all the coal-fired power plants in the world and rank them by intensity of or emissions, and just take the top 5%, and you could replace those with some zero carbon energy, that would be an amount of emissions equal to 150% of all the livestock emissions in the world. It's not the livestock. It hasn't been a serious conversation. I'm not saying it's not something to pay attention to, and there's lots of energy and effort going into those areas. But it's just not been a serious conversation. One study in the US said, what would happen if we eliminated livestock agriculture in the US? And the reduction in emissions was something below 2.5% of US and less and about 0.4% of total of global, but it would come at the cost of imbalancing our food system. And they said creating, I would say, exacerbating essential nutrient deficiencies. Doesn't sound like a good trade to me.
So coming at the expense of human health. And then you've already talked about the benefits to
The environment.
The environment, the insect species, the soil improvement, there's potential there, and that we've seen and we have evidence of. So we have all of those potential benefits being knocked out, and human health. I mean, this just keeps getting forgotten in this argument. We've touched on protein not being a protein, animal sourced protein not being so plant-based is not equivalent to the protein and cannot give the rest of the nutrients, the omegas and the amino acids, they're fundamental for brain development and to prevent stunting. So we've got a skewed argument. That's pretty much what you're saying. So as individuals, as families, as mums, and what can we do? And you started mentioning some of the personal actions. So what actions, for example, have you taken in your personal life? I know you came to low carb. I think that's particularly you advocate for that type of lifestyle. So what actions have you taken for your food, for your health, and for the environment yourself?
Well, so my diet is pretty simple. It's heavy on the animal source foods, so eggs, beef, occasionally lamb, pork, sometimes fish, mostly canned fish, although I live where I can get some good salmon and things like that. Full fat dairy, cheese, and butter for me, not for my wife. She has a sensitivity. And so it's important for people. One of the things I've noticed from what others say is that one of the things that happens is if they go on, a beef and water diet for a month or so, and they see what gets better. You're not going to kill yourself. You're not going to clog your arteries. You're not, none of that is true. Okay. And they find all these things that they had just been living with that now aren't there anymore. And so then you can begin the process of very deliberately adding things back in that you feel like you want to eat, and seeing if that triggers anything, sensitivities. Cereal seems to be, wheat seems to be something that triggers a lot of issues in people. And again, I'm not that kind of doctor. But so for us, we will frequently get ground meat and brown up like 3 pounds in a frying pan and put that in the fridge. It's just Nancy and I in the house. And then we'll add some of that. I'll do eggs scrambled with that. Nancy gets some like sliced cabbage or some other sort of broccoli kind of shreds, or some other like zucchini squash, low starch vegetables. And so we have a little difference, but it's nothing that we can't manage easily. A grill steak and have leftover either in the freezer that can be thawed later, or some in the fridge, dice it up. Again, the same sort of approach. When we first got started, she was making low carb muffins with wheat bran. Well, that's where we were then, right? We have more resources now. Um, you know, finding some of the old cookbooks is one way. Going in the U.S., we've had this extension service where once upon a time they were trying to teach people things about cooking and food preservation and those sorts of things. And so a lot of that information is still available and we can find it online. I would imagine that a similar thing with farm advisors took place in Australia, and whatever the equivalent of the Department of Agriculture. Well, I know CSIRO is a body that has some agricultural effort, but I know they do more than just agriculture. So I would encourage people to look for that kind of information. Again, prioritize protein. Don't be afraid of the fat that comes naturally with it. We probably need a lot more protein than we've been eating, and certainly more than has been recommended. And so if that is the feature, and then non-starchy vegetables, then it depends on what your goals are. Are you trying to lose weight? Well, you may need to be a little more strict. If you're happy with where you are and your markers of health are good, then, maybe we call them cane berries, blackberries, blueberries, raspberries with, heavy cream. Maybe that's a fine treat. Nuts for me are problematic because I don't have an off switch. You know, I had to be told that, a handful of nuts is not the amount I can physically hold. It's some
I know
small.
it's a larger quantity, and what I call that carb creep, when people are like, I just do not know why I'm plateauing, why the weight's now starting to kind of creep back on. It's like I then start to talk to them about the cheese and the nuts, that if they're
Mhm.
really into low carb, because that's often where that carb creep comes from. It just kind of
Sure.
escalates quite
I mean,
quickly.
everyone's different, and people will have, maybe there's some other things that, again, we need endocrinology, we need, medical, if that truly lasts and it's not the fact that, the carb creep. I mean, if we're really, being honest about it. And so, and it, I just try to be encouraging to people. Um, it is a journey, and there are people and resources available to help people along this journey. Um, and like you were saying before about the height of children, once upon a time, we ate quite differently than we eat today, and we had different indicators of health. So this is not the way we eat today is a very modern thing, and not everything that's modern is necessarily better. And the same thing could be said about the good old days, right? People are very romantic about the good old days, but they didn't have to live in them. So but I just give people the freedom, I guess, to explore um, options that now, my goodness, the other day I found 24 authorities and published papers documenting and advocating against vegan and vegetarian diets for pregnant women and infants.
Yeah.
And when we have organizations like EAT-Lancet advocating diets that are essentially mimicking the reality on the ground in Africa, I don't care what it is you're trying to achieve. You're harming people, and we need to give people the freedom to ignore them. I mean, you do you, I don't care. But when you start getting yourself into policy or advocacy space and you influence dietary recommendations or what happens in schools, etc., then that's a different deal. So the I think it's really good news that's available, though. You hear, and now there's this emerging group of medical professionals looking at nutritional psychiatry.
That's so
And
exciting.
I have personal experience with mental illness in my family, with addiction in my family and in my own life. And so I'm really interested in this.
I was recently talking with Bitten Jonsson. I don't know if you've come across
Mm-hmm.
Bitten's work,
Yes, yes.
but talking to her about her own food addiction and also wider addictions, and just the strategies to help people. That she's very convinced that this ultra processed food and this sugar that's just so ubiquitous, it just filling children even before they've gone to school every day,
Mm.
is creating a tsunami of these types of problems for people. It's really stark. So, and ultra processed foods at the moment, 2/3 of UK children's foods are ultra processed.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this
Yeah.
is food converts so quickly into sugar in the system. It's doing things to the brain's reward system center. And then all of the other problems, even Peter, that it just pushes out real food,
Mm-hmm.
good nutrition. When you're filling with 2/3 of absolute
Yeah.
processed junk,
Yeah.
you're just not getting that. And
The speaker immediately before me in Sydney said, "Don't outsource your health," and I like that
good.
line.
Mm,
Your doctor is not your boss, right?
mm,
And if you are a parent, then you have your role with your children until they're of age and gone. So while start these things now, and the line that I came up with is the line that I've heard in other: nobody's coming. Nobody's going to come solve this. There are too many. I'm all for the people that want to affect change from guidelines down. All for that. At the same time, we need to acknowledge that there are a lot of interests against that. And so let's encourage each other, right? But we
mm,
have to do what we can do. And don't let the good be the enemy of the best, right? Or the ideal, or the perfect, right? And that's a concern that I have, where some people have actually said, well, if it's not going to be 100% organic, then you might as well not even start. It's like, no, sorry, stop. No, that's a belief system comparable to the Seventh-day Adventist belief system. And it's just as harmful.
And we're putting it out of reach of people over, I mean, you talk a lot about inequality, and I think that's probably one of your key motivations, and you're so kind and so funny. I would really encourage people to check out your presentations and yours. But, you talk about, people not being able to access this. So these people advocating for a certain way of living or supplementing, go on a plant-based majority diet and then supplement. But that's out of reach for a lot of people. In Australia, where I am, some of the communities, Dr. James Mukey posted a picture of some meat in a rural community shop, and it was just astronomical. It was like 4 or 5 times the amount you would get it for in the city. And talking to people who were supporting the Aboriginal communities in remote communities in Northern Territory, we were discussing that they struggle for any sort of fats, because they will only bring in canola and seed oils. They will not let the shop buy and sell the saturated, the tallows or the butters and things like coconut oils. And they can't get access to meat. So they are on such a processed food diet, and their metabolic health is just absolute dire. You've got cases of dialysis in young men, and diabetes in people in their 20s. It's rife. So all of this is, I think, inequality really is a huge part of what you do. And you speak and you explain things really beautifully, but you're really kind as well about some people for their religious or ethical or cultural reasons. I've got a number of friends who are different religions: Hindu, Jehovah's Witness, a Muslim, and they will not eat certain meats. And they're trying to get their protein from other sources. So we need to also be kind and encompassing and not tribal ourselves. I think some of the best people are these plant-based eating people, because they're ethical. They want the best thing for their own health, their children's health. They want the best thing for the planet. They really care about animal welfare. So it's just the narrative and the perhaps the perspective has been skewed, and the logic has been skewed away from the actual fundamental stark reality that these foods provide complete nutrition. They're the building blocks for so much in life, not just your stature and your weight, but your brain development and being able to be cognitively well. So I think that comes across in how you explain things. So I would encourage people to check out your resources. In terms of, Peter, how just to close, how could people best find you and connect with you? What would you suggest?
I'm all over social media. If you find another Ballerstedt on social media, let me know. They're probably a relation, and I haven't met them yet. I've shared some links, but on Twitter X or whatever I'm supposed to call Twix, I'm on Grass-Based, one word. Instagram, same name. I have a Facebook page called Grass-Based Health. I've started Substack, ruminati.substack.com. You can reach me by email, peter.ballerstedt@gmail.com. I'm on LinkedIn by name. I'm on YouTube by name. So if you search for Peter Ballerstedt, you're likely to find some things.
We'll track you down. And again, I would definitely recommend your presentations. You're across these fundamental crises that we're facing, and you do it with such grace and humour. I don't really know how you do it, but I really, really appreciate your talks and your research and your information put out there. But thank you so much for spending time with me, and I've definitely learned something. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire, for the opportunity. It was a lovely visit.
Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please make sure to subscribe. This really helps us to be able to create more content.